For many who've engaged in political or philosophical debates, the straw man is quite a familiar concept. At its most basic, one speaker takes the view of the other and misrepresents it for the express purpose of rebuttal. It intentionally assigns a mirage in the place of the opposing argument so as to lend undue credence to the strength of the speaker's argument as they quickly dismantle points that had never been made. For example, if a speaker was to argue that more money should be directed towards welfare programs as opposed to space exploration, a straw man would be to misrepresent the view as simply hating science. Regardless of if he had known it or not at the time, we've all experienced debate tactics similar to this, and on occasion even used it ourselves unknowingly during the heat of an argument. Less familiar to many, however, is the concept of the Steelman, where straw manning chooses to misrepresent and weaken. The Steelman chooses to uplift and strengthen, and it is at its core the exact opposite of straw manning. The principle ultimately advocates that when a speaker is faced with an argument, regardless of weakness or strength, it is in their best interest to take the strongest version of said argument and argue against that. In our previous example, a Steelman would be to represent the argument as there are important values that we place on the living standards of the most vulnerable in society. Therefore, we should seriously consider the opportunity cost of spending programs dedicated to higher order needs such as space exploration when there are many in society who can't meet the basic needs of adequate food, water, and shelter. Now, this argument is nowhere near flawless, nor is it particularly rigorous, but in the 5 minutes I spent in this section of the script, I'm pretty confident it's an improvement from the previous misrepresentation of hating science. Another often compared principle similar to Steelmanning is the principle of charity. This was first coined in Substances Without Substrata by philosopher Neil Wilson in the academic journal The Review of Metaphysics. The hypothetical scenario being posed was where an individual named Charles listed the 5 truth statements. 1. Caesar conquered Gaul. 2. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. 3. Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March. 4. Caesar was addicted to the use of the ablative absolute. 5. Caesar was married to Boadicea. Now, Caesar as a name could signify a variety of individuals, but Wilson writes, quote, "We act on what might be called the principle of charity. We select as designatum that individual which will make the largest possible number of Charles's statements true. In this case, it is the individual Julius Caesar," unquote. This designation ultimately means that statements 1 to 4 are correct, whilst the 5th is false. However, Steelmanning takes it a step further than this. It is not only taking the most charitable and truthful reading of your opponent's argument, it is going the extra step to strengthen it, to build it up, so to speak. It means regardless of the opposing argument's strength, one should on principle attempt to take the strongest version of the argument and, as the philosopher Daniel Dennett would say, quote, "You should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, 'Thanks, I wish I'd thought of putting it that way,'" unquote. Now, as a debate tactic for fostering good discussion, Steelmanning also has its downsides. For one, the attempt of Steelmanning doesn't always mean a Steelman. For example, whilst the principle of charity emphasizes more on accurately understanding and representing your opponent, Steelmanning adds the input of one's own personal ideas of what a strengthened argument means to the mix. A person being Steelman might feel patronized, or worse yet, having ideas attributed to them which they never intended to convey, simply because the other person thought it would strengthen the argument. And ironically enough, this can lead straight back to straw manning, where someone feels words have been put in their mouth. And so it is of critical importance to walk a thin line of strengthening arguments but staying true to the perspective of your opponent. Now, onto why perhaps you should entertain the idea of using the Steelman. In the Atlantic article The Highest Form of Disagreement by Conor Friedersdorf, he quotes from the NPR talk show 1A when the host discusses his motivation and vision for the show. Quote, "My job as the host of 1A is basically what Tony did in West Side Story, to convince people to stop rumbling and just fight fair. If we don't do that, our democracy is in trouble. A good rumble feels good. It feels good to see somebody take down those SOBs who you blame for all the problems in this country. Democracy is a contact sport. Everyone gets bruises, even the winners. And the kind of bickering we see today is not only unproductive, it's cowardly. If you don't have the guts to focus on ideas and stop tearing down individuals, you belong in the stands, not on the field." Unquote. Steelmanning, and more importantly, the principle behind Steelmanning, is ultimately, at its core, a respect for discussion. It is a respect for the idea that discussion can be productive, that is not just a means for power and influence over the audience, and that cooler heads may indeed prevail. That one engages in discussion not just to win, not just to get a clip of a sick burn from a 2-hour discussion to be shared on Twitter, but to align one's argument with the truest version of their personal values. As Messinger writes in the blog quoted by the article, quote, "We probably know best which arguments are most difficult for our position, because we know our beliefs' real weak points and what kind of evidence we tend to find compelling. So I challenge you, when arguing with someone, to use that information to look for ways to make their arguments better, more difficult for you to counter. This is the highest form of disagreement. If you know of a better counter to your own argument than the one they're giving, say so. If you know of evidence that supports their side, bring it up. If their argument rests on an untrue piece of evidence, talk about the hypothetical case in which they were right. Take their arguments seriously and make them as good as possible. Because if you can't respond to that better version, you've got some thinking to do, even if you're more right than the person you're arguing with." Unquote. For much of this video, I've mostly focused on discussing the reasoning and specifics of Steelmanning, but I'd like to digress into the second major component of the topic, and that is the principle behind Steelmanning. It is well and good to know it as a concept, but what is equally as important is that one understands the underlying principle behind it, and this is ultimately where it shares the most in common with the principle of charity. In philosopher Daniel Dennett's book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, he establishes a list of rules he names Rappaport's rules, after psychologist and game theorist Anatole Rappaport. They are aimed at facilitating productive discussion and goes as follows. 1. You should attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, "Thanks, I wish I had thought of putting it that way." 2. You should list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. 3. You should mention anything you have learned from your target. 4. Only then are you permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. He goes on to explain the value of this formula in the quote, "One immediate effect of following these rules is that your target will be a receptive audience for your criticism. You have already shown that you understand their positions as well as they do and have demonstrated good judgment. You agree with them on some important matters and have even been persuaded by something they said." Unquote. Dennett also references that he had initially uncovered this in his correspondence with the late Anatole Rappaport, who in turn built on much of the ideas of the American psychologist Carl Rogers and what is known today as Rogerian rhetoric. Whilst Rogers was far more prominently known for his works on therapy, he had also developed a form of rhetoric that incorporated some of the techniques used in therapy and presented itself as an alternative to traditional Aristotelian rhetoric. Whilst traditional rhetoric relies on an audience to arbitrate between speakers, Rogerian rhetoric focuses on how individuals could sort out communication discussion when it was just between two individuals, as is often the case in everyday encounters and debates, whether it be at the dinner table or in a car ride. In the journal article by Professor Douglas Brent writes, quote, "Rogers 1951 describes how as a young practitioner he quickly discovered that he could not change the attitudes or behavior of his clients by rational argument. The ideal rhetorical situation as described by Plato involves an audience which, like his hero Socrates, is not less happy to be refuted than to refute. Alas, this attitude is rare among real, vulnerable human beings who are not characters in a Platonic dialogue. Clients in therapy at the peak of their vulnerability are particularly unhappy to be refuted." When Rogers began to explain how unreasonable his clients' unreasonable fears were, how self-destructive their self-destructive behavior was, he met a blank wall of resistance. The problem, he decided, was that rational argument of this kind always implies a form of evaluation. Argument may convince a person to buy this kind of car or to vote for that politician, but the closer the subject of argument comes to the beliefs that constitute the core of a person's sense of self, of identity, the more any attempt to change beliefs is perceived as a threat and met with walls of defense. The way around these walls, Rogers discovered, was to change the role of the therapist. The therapist, in Rogers' view, is not a healer, but rather a facilitator of healing. She does not explain her point of view to the client, but instead listens actively to the client as he gets in touch with his own thoughts and emotions. In the journal article by Young, Becker, and Pike, they sum up Roger's ideas into 4 simple steps. 1. An introduction to the problem and a demonstration that the opponent's position is understood. 2. A statement of the context in which the opponent's position may be valid. 3. A statement of the writer's position, including the context in which it is valid. 4. A statement of how the opponent's position will benefit if he were to adopt elements of the writer's position. If the writer can show that the position complements each other, that each supplies what the other lacks, so much the better. Ultimately, the key being that the other individual recognizes your distinct desire to accurately listen and portray them accurately. Brent ties this back to the contemporary concept of Steelmanning with, quote, "To do so, they must learn how to imagine with empathy and how to read with empathy." By imagining with empathy, I mean more than teaching students to imagine another's views. This would be little different from classical audience analysis. I mean teaching students to think carefully about how another person could hold views that are different from one's own. This is what Young, Beck, and Pike mean by finding the context in which the opposing viewpoint is valid. Rather than simply imagining an isolated set of arguments for an opposing viewpoint, the writer must imagine the entire worldview that allows those arguments to exist, and makes them valid for the other, unquote. That therefore it is not only the specific act of Steelmanning or embodying a principle of charity that matters, but also a form of intellectual empathy that must underlie any act of Steelman or charitable reading. It is, in other words, the ultimate act of humanization, by recognizing the ability of one's opponent to form conclusions of value and examination when taken in certain context or worldview. Note, however, that this recognition is not the same as an acknowledgement of agreement or truth. It is simply to say that there is reason my opponent thinks this way, as irrational or deluded as it might be. And for me to present my argument at its strongest, it would be in my interest to understand where the argument comes from, unquote. Brent builds on this concept in the analysis, quote, "Once a person has fully internalized the process of inquiry into another's beliefs, not just the surface of those beliefs, but the underlying experiences and values from which they spring, it will be proportionally more difficult for him to treat others as mere instruments for the fulfillment of his own desires," unquote. Brent ends with the story of a particular class he was teaching. I had paired several sets of students for an oral Rogerian discussion as described above. One pair decided to discuss drunk driving. They're not exactly on opposing sides, who would be for drunk driving, but they had very different views of the problem and its consequences. Was that alright? I told them that it was. In reality, differences of opinion seldom divide along neat bipolar lines of cleavage that allowed pat yes/no sides. Lisa went first. Her initial statement of position was much fuller than usual. In somewhat abbreviated form, it went like this. The year I was born, my grandmother was killed by a drunk driver. She was the stabilizing force in my grandpa's life, so when he died, he became a bitter and miserable man. The only time I've spent with my grandpa is when he lived with our family after he was seriously injured in another drinking and driving incident. This time he was a drunk. This accident left him crippled and even more miserable. I see my grandpa once a year. He is usually in his wheelchair complaining. What I think is, you did this to yourself. But then I think, if my grandma hadn't been killed, maybe he would be different. The driver that killed her robbed me. I've seen pictures of her. The one that stands out in my memory is her giggling in my dad's purple dune buggy. She was wearing a short skirt, had a beehive, and was 50 years old. I never got to meet her. My family does not dwell on what happened so many years ago. Galen went through the motions of reflecting back Lisa's statement, appreciating the pain and the anger contained within it. But there really wasn't much to uncover. Lisa's eloquent narrative hid little that needed to be dug up by Rogerian techniques, and they reached agreement very quickly that Galen had got it. Galen's opening statement was equally full. I also learned a very hard lesson, but from a different perspective than you, Lisa. I too was the victim of a drunk driver, and I too lost something that day I will never be able to regain. The difference is that a member of my family was not killed by a drunk driver. A member of my family was the drunk driver. When I was 19 years old, my fiancé went to a stag one night. They all drank and they drove home. On the way home, he went through a stop sign and broadsided a car, killing a woman in the backseat. From that day on, my life was never the same. While the court case dragged on, I was trying to plan a future, but since my fiancée was charged with 4 counts of criminal negligence causing death, jail was a real possibility. Several people who didn't feel comfortable confronting my fiancé said terrible, hurtful things to me, as if I condoned this act he had chosen. Friends dropped us as if we had a contagious virus, including the same guys my fiancé had grown up with and partied with that night, and also drank and drove themselves home. I also grieved for the family of the woman who was killed, a woman about my mother's age. I kept thinking that it could have been her. My fiancé was never able to talk about his feelings about that night. Though we got married and were together for 20 years, it set a pattern for him of avoiding difficult situations and emotions. He continued to drink and drive, perhaps 10 times in 20 years, but it was 10 times too many, and it was the one thing we argued about until our marriage fell apart. I always wanted to tell the woman's family how truly sorry I was for their loss. I thought of her every day for many years, so that now the incident is a part of the fabric of my being. I don't drink and drive, yet I feel the same shame as if I had been behind the wheel that day. What more could be said? What could be reflected back? Lisa repeated back the pain that Galen had expressed, but there was little need. Galen had said what needed to be said, without benefit of quasi-Rogerian questioning. And as for working through propositions to isolate areas of mutual validity, well, as you might imagine, we never got that far. At the end of their Rogerian discussion, they shared the background of their topic. 20 years apart in age, they were not acquainted except through class discussions on rhetoric. Galen had recognized Lisa's name at the beginning of term, but they had not discussed the incident until they were paired by random number draw. It was at that time they decided to try discussing their beliefs on drunk driving, because they shared far more than a general interest in the subject. The accidents they had discussed were actually the same accident. Galen's fiancé had killed Lisa's grandmother. The class was left speechless by the courage they displayed in talking about this incident in front of people who until 2 months ago had been total strangers. They also had the courage to revisit the long-standing grief and anger with each other and with their families. Lisa, who had never really talked about her parents about the incident and what it had meant to her family, talked now, and gave a copy of Galen's speaking notes to her father. A renewed process of healing through language was begun. Rogerian rhetoric is lauded for its power to build bridges, but in this instance, the elaborate scaffolding of Rogerian rhetoric was unnecessary, because Galen and Lisa, through the most impossible of chances, had already found the opportunity to work through their long separated feelings in both private and public rhetoric. The bridges were already in place when they stood to speak. There is no news from Auschwitz, but there is news from Communication Studies 461. One news item is that Rogerian rhetoric is not always necessary if the conversants have the will to communicate. But the more important news is that the power of rhetoric, Rogerian or not, to heal is as powerful as its ability to persuade. It has a power that is beyond analysis." Unquote. And it is on this I'd like to end. In a contemporary world torn by polarization and almost universal feeling of talking past each other, perhaps part of the solution might at least lie in a new approach to discussion. The world will never agree on everything, nor will our differences be settled overnight, but perhaps a more charitable, kind, and truthful future awaits us if we took the time to engage in the art of the Steelman a little bit more. Thank you guys so much for watching. This channel will be mostly dedicated to political, social, and occasionally philosophical discussion, so feel free to subscribe if that's what you're into. Catch you guys next time.